Every town has its secrets, but some are more haunting than others. June 7th, 1984. A Thursday like any other in Houston, Texas. The morning sun baked the sidewalks as people carried on with their daily routines, coffee cups in hand, newspapers tucked under arms, the hum of suburbia continuing undisturbed. It was, by all accounts, an ordinary day. Until it was not. Debora Sue Schatz, known affectionately by her family and friends as May, had started her shift at the Westheimer post office. She joked with co-workers, sorted her usual route, and volunteered like she always did to cover for someone else. That day, it happened to be the West Memorial neighborhood, a quiet, upper-class enclave filled with manicured lawns and shaded cul-de-sacs. May never came back. What unfolded that afternoon was not just a murder. It was a collision between innocence and senseless violence, between working-class warmth and privileged indifference, and it would unravel into one of the most tragic and bizarre legal sagas in Texas history. But to understand how a young postal worker ended up in a shallow grave, we need to go back. Not to the crime scene, not yet, but to the heart of who May was. She was born on September 16, 1960, in Houston, the sixth of 9 children, in a modest but loving home. Her parents, Albert and Barbara Schatz, did not have much money, but they had each other. Their small, green house on Kempwood Street was cramped, chaotic, and full of life. That is where May learned everything that mattered: how to care for others, how to laugh with abandon, and how to love fiercely. She was not a straight-A student. In fact, she left school in the 7th grade. But that did not mean she lacked purpose. May knew exactly what she wanted from life: a family, a home, a little joy. She did not chase wealth or prestige. Her dreams were simple: to be surrounded by people she loved, to dance on Saturday nights, and to drive a red Corvette one day. A promise, she whispered to herself, as she worked shift after shift. But it was not just her dreams that made her memorable. It was her presence. Honey blonde hair that bounced when she laughed, a radiant smile that softened the hardest days, and a laugh, that kind of laugh that made others laugh with her, even if they did not know why. May did not just light up a room. She brought warmth to entire households. She was the kind of person who called her mom every single day. Not out of duty, but because she wanted to. She showed up to dinners, helped her siblings with their kids, danced with toddlers at family barbecues, and left fingerprints of love on everyone she met. She adored children, worked at a daycare, became a dental assistant for pediatric patients. But the big break came when she landed a job as a postal worker, a job with benefits, decent pay, and the kind of stability that working-class people like her fought for. She had been on the job for just over a year when she died. Her proudest moment, buying her gold Mustang. The red Corvette, that was next on her list. May was more than her resume. She was a sister, an aunt, a daughter, the fun one, the kind one, the dependable one. She loved Elvis with a teenager's devotion. She would sign her name as May Presley and cry for days after his death. When she smiled, it reached all the way to her eyes. On that fateful June day, she had no idea that the simple act of covering a coworker's shift would lead her to the doorstep of someone who would shatter her world and that of everyone who loved her. The neighborhood was quiet, almost unnervingly so. Linwood Hollow, a small cul-de-sac with towering oaks and large brick homes, was the last stop on her extra route. At the end of the street stood the Port residence, stately, manicured, and cold. Behind that front door, 17-year-old David Port stood waiting. Alone, but not idle. He was not a stranger to the community. He came from a wealthy, influential family. His parents were respected, educated, and well-connected. But David had troubles of his own learning, difficulties, emotional instability, and something darker simmering beneath the surface. When May rang the bell, it was not a cry for help. It was just another delivery, another package, another polite smile exchanged before moving on to the next address. But this was not another address. This was the last one she would ever visit. David opened the door and pointed a .22 caliber pistol at her. No warning, no words, no reason. He forced her inside at gunpoint. Upstairs. Silent. Tense. May did not scream. She followed his orders, praying this would end without bloodshed. But as soon as she sensed a moment to flee, she bolted. 2 gunshots rang out. She fell. In that instant, the world shifted. The laughter she carried, the dreams she cherished, the family that waited for her dinner-time visits, all of it collapsed in a thunderclap of violence. But it was not over. David, showing no sign of panic, checked her pulse, dragged her body into a black garbage bag, and began cleaning up. He wiped down the walls, scrubbed the floors, washed his shoes. Methodically, coldly. Then he loaded May's body into the trunk of his car and drove around Houston with a corpse behind him, stopping for food along the way. That is not a metaphor. People walked past his parked car, unaware of the horror just inches away, as he munched on fast food like nothing had happened. Eventually, he drove out to Cypress Creek, a muddy, secluded area far from prying eyes. He dragged her body to the creek bed, shoved her deep into the mud, tossed in her mailbag and some bloody rags, and left her to disappear, as if she had never existed. But May Schatz did exist. And her story does not end with the mud. Back in Spring Branch, her mother Barbara waited for the usual check-in call. It never came. When her supervisor called the house that night to ask where May was, Barbara knew. Not logically, but intuitively. With a mother's dread that pierces all reason. She is in trouble, she whispered to herself. Something's wrong. By midnight, the entire Schatz family was searching the streets, flashlights in hand, hearts pounding, voices hoarse from calling her name into the dark. They did not find her that night, but they never stopped looking, and neither will we. The dawn of June 8th brought no comfort to the Schatz household. Barbara had not slept. She could not. Every creak in the house made her heart lurch. Every silence pressed heavier on her chest. She kept hearing May's voice, faint but insistent, calling out from somewhere far away, "Mama, come get me. Bring me home." It was not a hallucination. Not to her. It was a mother's soul tethered to her daughters, tugging against the unseen cord that bound them. That morning, she saw something else. Something that chilled her deeper than the absence of a phone call ever could. As she sat in her bedroom, eyes burning with exhaustion, she noticed a shape forming in the curtain's folds. It was May's face, her blonde hair hanging across her cheeks, her skin marked with angry red welts. Barbara blinked and blinked, but the vision would not fade. Hours later, those very red welts would be discovered on May's body, caused by fire ants crawling across her lifeless skin in the mud. How Barbara knew, no one could explain, but grief, in its purest form, has a way of piercing through time. As the Schatz family organized search parties and combed the neighborhood, a second, quieter alarm was triggered across town. Bernard Port, David's father, walked into a nearby police station. His teenage son was missing. The previous night, Bernard and his wife had come home to find David gone. There was a bullet hole in the wall by the staircase. That alone might have been enough to raise questions. But Bernard had more. He revealed that David was diabetic and had a developmental disability, possibly on the autism spectrum. He had not been formally diagnosed, but the signs were there. His moods were unpredictable. His behavior at times blank, at times erratic. Bernard did not understand it, and neither did the doctors. Back then, in 1984, mental health resources were limited, especially for conditions that did not come with clear labels. But what he did know was this: his son was gone, and something terrible had happened. When detectives followed Bernard back to his home on Linwood Hollow, they began to see the cracks in the perfect suburban facade. David's bedroom held an arsenal: 2 pistols, 2 rifles, a shotgun. It was Texas, sure, but even the most lenient gun enthusiast might pause at the sight of so many weapons in the hands of a 17-year-old with emotional instability. One of the pistols, a .22 caliber, the same caliber used in May's killing, had clearly been fired recently. And then came the first unmistakable sign of blood. David's stepmother, Odette, produced one of his tennis shoes. It had been scrubbed, but not well enough. Reddish stains were still visible along the rubber sole. Forensic teams later confirmed it: human blood. At that point, David Port was not just a missing person. He became a suspect. But then, just as quickly as he vanished, David came back. It was Friday afternoon. The police were still swarming the neighborhood, interviewing neighbors, searching the woods, trying to retrace May's final steps. And then someone shouted, "There he is!" A maroon Chevy appeared, creeping into the area. David was behind the wheel. When he saw the flashing lights, he hit the gas, a panicked attempt to flee. The chase did not last long. It crashed into a parked car not far from the Port home. Officers drew their weapons, dragged him from the vehicle, and slapped on handcuffs. Then, something no one expected happened. David started talking, not panicking, not sobbing, not asking for a lawyer. He told the officers everything. How he opened the door with a gun in hand. How he marched May upstairs. How he shot her when she tried to escape. How he tied her up, cleaned the blood, drove around with her body in the trunk, ate fast food, dragged her into the mud near Cypress Creek. There was no hesitation, no tears, no remorse. The confession tumbled out like a grocery list. Emotionless. Matter of fact, when detectives asked him why, his answer was as chilling as the crime itself. "I did not even know her. That was it. No hatred. No motive. No rage. Just nothing." It was the kind of moment that leaves seasoned officers looking at each other, unsure of what they are even dealing with. Was this a psychotic break? A sociopathic teen? A tragedy born from untreated mental illness? Or was it something even darker, a glimpse into the void that sometimes hides behind a human face? David claimed he had dumped May's body in Buffalo Bayou. Search teams were dispatched immediately, sweeping the area with boats, diving into murky water, hoping for closure, but they found nothing. At first, investigators assumed David was confused, maybe lying, maybe disassociating from reality. But then, as fate would have it, a stranger watching the evening news changed the course of the case. A tow truck driver, sitting at home, saw David's mugshot flash across the screen and nearly dropped his plate. "That is the kid I pulled out of the mud yesterday," he told his wife. "He was stuck off Cypress Creek, near Highway 290. He called the police immediately. 20 miles from where David claimed he had left the body, investigators arrived at the banks of Cypress Creek. There, wrapped in a black plastic bag, they found May Schatz, just as David had described, 2 bullet wounds to the head, red ant bites scattered across her body, her mail satchel nearby, bloody rags soaking into the mud. The scene was a tableau of cruelty. Harrods, quiet, tragic, final. They had found her. The crime was confirmed. The killer arrested. The confession obtained. But in a twisted turn of fate, this was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. When May's body was pulled from the muddy creek, it should have marked the beginning of closure for the Schatz family. But instead, it signaled the start of a legal nightmare, one that would stretch for decades, and leave both justice and morality mangled in its wake. David Port had confessed. He had led investigators even indirectly to the body. The physical evidence supported everything he said. The motive remained a chilling blank, but the act itself was not in question. And yet, the case would soon twist into something surreal. It began with a single phone call. Bernard Port, David's father, lawyered up fast. This was not just about protecting his son, it was about protecting the Port name. A family of influence and affluence. The Ports had connections, resources, and a clear understanding of how to navigate a courtroom. Bernard wasted no time hiring one of the most formidable defense attorneys in Texas, Randy Schaefer, who had trained under the legendary racehorse Haynes, a man known more for winning than for morality. And then, in what felt like a movie script gone sideways, Schaefer brought in another legal heavyweight, Jack Zimmerman. These were not your average public defenders. This was a legal dream team. And their strategy, not to deny what happened, but to dismantle the prosecution's ability to prove it. The first grenade came during the grand jury proceedings, when Bernard and his wife Odette were called to testify about David's whereabouts on the day of the murder. They refused. Their attorneys argued that Jewish religious law prohibited them from testifying against a family member. To compel them, they claimed, would be an act of anti-Semitism. The shockwaves were immediate. Harris County prosecutors, caught completely off guard, had no idea how to respond. It was unprecedented. The Ports were not arguing that David was innocent. They were arguing that being forced to answer questions would violate their faith. It worked, at least temporarily. The trial stalled, but in the court of public opinion, things were unraveling. Newspapers across the country picked up the story. Religious freedom or legal evasion, headlines asked. Talk shows debated the ethics. Letters flooded in. Some expressed sympathy for the Ports. Others were outraged on behalf of the Schatz family. Then the hate mail started. Anti-Semitic slurs, bomb threats, swastikas drawn on courthouse doors. The judge's house was vandalized. What started as a legal debate became a cultural flashpoint, and both families were caught in the middle of a storm. And amid the noise, the grief-stricken Schatz family sat quietly, watching their daughter's memory get lost in technicalities and arguments they could not afford to fight. Barbara Schatz, May's mother, begged for peace. But peace would not come. Her husband Albert, broken by his daughter's murder, collapsed from a heart attack just weeks after the funeral. Doctors called it natural. The family called it what it really was, heartbreak. 2 months later, May's brother-in-law died suddenly as well. Another blow, another funeral. Grief was stacking on top of grief. And yet, the Ports? They were already entertaining offers from publishers and movie producers. They had the money and the narrative. A misunderstood teenager from a misunderstood family, persecuted by the public and the press. To the Schatz family, it was unthinkable. May's sister, Milad, said it best. "We did not sue for money. We sued to stop them from getting rich off my sister's murder." They filed a $5 million wrongful death suit against the Ports in August 1984, not out of vengeance, but out of desperation. They did not want David's crime to become someone else's payday. And still, the criminal trial dragged on. By March of 1985, it was finally ready for court. But even that came with a twist. The trial was moved from Houston to New Braunfels, a small town with deep German roots. Whether intentional or not, it meant a mostly non-Jewish jury would be judging a Jewish teenager accused of murdering a girl with a German surname. David's legal team tried to suppress his confession. They argued he had not been properly advised of his rights, that his mental state was too fragile to give a reliable statement, that police had coerced him not with violence, but with pressure, confusion, and fear. The prosecution fought back. They argued the confession was spontaneous, unforced, and chilling in its detail. The judge agreed. The confession was allowed. It was the turning point. The jury sat silently as David's words were read aloud. They listened to how he tied May's hands, how he stuffed her in a bag, how he washed his shoes like he was doing laundry, not erasing a life. By the time deliberations began, there was not much doubt left. David Port was convicted of murder and sentenced to 75 years in prison. But as the Schatz family tried to breathe, the legal system threw them another gut punch. In August of 1987, the Texas Third Court of Appeals reversed David's conviction. Why? Because the confession, the one they had all heard, was not written. Under Texas law, only written or videotaped confessions were admissible. David's words had been oral, and that made all the difference. The court did not say he was innocent. They did not deny the crime. They just said the rules were not followed. It was, legally speaking, a technicality. But for the Schatz family, it felt like a betrayal. They had buried May once. Now they had to bury justice. To the Schatz family, the courtroom reversal felt like salt in an open wound. It was not just about the law anymore. It was about decency, about morality. They had lost May once now. It felt like the system was trying to take her from them again. What happened next was not a legal process. It was a psychological torment that stretched for years. A seesaw of appeals, reversals, new motions, and unanswered prayers. After the appellate court tossed David's conviction, prosecutors scrambled to save the case. They took it up with the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, the highest court in the state for criminal matters. To everyone's surprise, that court reinstated David's conviction. Their decision was clear. While the confession might not have been written down, the totality of the circumstances, the physical evidence, the bloodied shoe, the pistol, the statements to police was enough to convict. Justice, though slow and twisted, would not be derailed by a procedural snag. David Port returned to prison. But there was one more twist waiting. Back in 1977, in an attempt to reduce prison overcrowding, The Texas legislature passed a law allowing for mandatory supervised release for certain inmates after serving a portion of their sentence. It was an obscure law buried in bureaucracy that nobody expected to apply to a case like this. But it did. Despite being sentenced to 75 years, David would not serve the full term. He would not even serve half. After 30 years behind bars, his release became mandatory under that outdated law. In June 2014, almost 30 years to the day after May was murdered, David Port walked out of prison, a free man. It was quiet. No press, no cameras, no statement. Just a man stepping out of a system that had finally, reluctantly, let him go. For the Schatz family, it was like losing her all over again. They had fought for every shred of justice, endured every court date, sat through endless hearings, watched the man who murdered their daughter receive top-tier legal defense while they held bake sales to pay for gas to attend trials, and in the end, he was free. But what makes this story endure, what keeps it pulsing through Texas history, is not just the crime or the trial, it is the after. Because May never really left. Barbara Schatz, even in the depth of her grief, believed her daughter still lingered. She saw signs, felt chills in quiet rooms, heard whispers on the wind. One afternoon, not long after May's death, Barbara sat in the backyard alone, staring at the old swing set. It had not moved in days. No children played there anymore. And then suddenly, with no wind, no explanation, the swing began to rock. Back and forth. Back and forth. Barbara believed it was May. Other family members reported similar things. The family dog, old and lethargic, would sometimes wander to May's empty room and whimper softly. The phone would ring at odd hours, but there'd be no one there. Lights flickered, even after the wiring was replaced. And then came the photograph. That Christmas, the Schatz family gathered for what felt like an impossible holiday. They posed in front of the tree, all the siblings, the kids, the grandkids. Smiles were forced, tears held back. When they developed the photo weeks later, they saw something else. A faint shape near the edge of the frame. Wispy. Almost translucent. Like a figure just out of reach, hovering among them. Some said it was a lens flare. Others said dust. But the family knew. They knew it was her. May, even in death, refused to leave them. And the world, at least in some small way, agreed. In January 2001, the United States Postal Service dedicated a post office in May's honor. A building now stands on the corner of Rogerdale and Westheimer in Houston, not far from where May once clocked in every morning with a smile and a bag full of letters. Her name is etched on the plaque outside. For most, it is just another government building. Another post office, among many. But for her family, for the people who remember, it is something more. It is proof that May mattered. That her laughter, her kindness, her love for family, those things did not die in the mud. They were planted. And they grew even after all the courts, all the delays, all the pain her spirit endured. There is something profoundly cruel about senseless crimes. They do not just steal a life. They rob families of meaning. They defy explanation. They deny closure. Debora Sue Schatz was not a political figure. Not a celebrity. Not a name meant for headlines. She was a young woman, working hard, living simply, loving her family, dreaming, like all of us, of something better just around the corner. She did not die in a war zone or a criminal underworld. She died in the bright daylight of a Texas suburb on a workday, delivering letters, killed by a boy with a gun, and no reason. And that is what makes it all so unbearable. There was no motive, no grudge, no moment of passion. Just a moment of blank cruelty from a teenager who did not even understand himself. How do you process something like that? For the Schatz family, the answer was, you do not. You carry it. You survive it. You wake up each day in a house that feels quieter than before, and you try to fill it with memories that do not hurt as much. May's siblings grew older. Her nieces and nephews, the ones she used to play on the floor with, now had kids of their own. But none of them forgot her. None of them stopped saying her name. Even after 3 decades, the pain had not faded. It had only changed form, from shock to anger to resignation. In interviews, some of them described a kind of bitter acceptance. Not forgiveness, exactly. Just the realization that the world was not fair and never had been. Others remained defiant, angry, tired of hearing about the Port family's sorrow, about David's condition, about what it must have been like to raise a troubled child. What about May? What about the woman who did nothing wrong, who smiled at everyone, who did not fight for power or protest in the streets, who just wanted to finish her route and go home for dinner? Why did her voice disappear from the conversation? It is a question that haunts many stories like this. When a tragedy becomes a spectacle, the victim can get lost in the chaos, replaced by arguments, headlines, legal loopholes, and public discourse. We start talking about lawyers and judges, about precedent and mental health, about appeals and parole boards, and somewhere in that noise, the humanity fades. But here's what matters. May Schatz was loved. She made people laugh. She dreamed of owning a red Corvette. She danced on weekends and cried when Elvis died. She showed up for her family. She worked hard. She covered for coworkers without complaint. She did not deserve what happened to her. No one does. And David Port, he walked free in June 2014. Not because anyone thought he was innocent, but because the system ran out of space. Literally, the law that freed him was not born out of mercy. It was born out of overcrowding, out of politics, out of paperwork. It is hard to think of a more brutal irony. May's family had waited 30 years for closure. Instead, they got a front row seat to the release of the man who stole everything from them. He served less than half his sentence, and she is still gone. But this story is not just about justice denied. It is about something deeper, something universal. It is about how fragile life is, how systems we trust can fail, how families can endure the unimaginable. It is about what we remember and what we choose to forget. In a world obsessed with headlines and court drama, May's story reminds us to look beyond the surface, to remember the victims, not just the names of their killers, to fight for justice, even when the odds are impossible, to believe against all odds that kindness still matters, that a good life, even if cut short, is never wasted, and maybe, most importantly, to realize that sometimes justice is not a verdict or a prison sentence. Sometimes, justice is the choice to keep someone's memory alive, to say their name, to tell their story, to refuse to let them vanish into the mud.